but I consider it to be my gallery of worthies, actually.
A gallery of worthies?
Yes, sir.
I took note that it seems you have a bust of myself as we came in the door.
Yes, you are correct. You know, many who come into the foyer here at my house want to observe me first, to the right. And then, as they turn about to speak with me, over my shoulder, they see your bust. They are immediately startled. I hold for a moment in hesitation and then smile and say yes. And there the two of us will look across at one and the other in opposition throughout death, as we had been in life. Oh, my friends and neighbors come to visit me.
Oh, dear me.
Frequently.
Quite a few friends and neighbors.
Yes, I'm happy to say. Good heavens, General, think about this a moment. You must be quite happy. The President of the United States has entered, and everyone remains seated. Here, we should go greet some of them. The gentleman here, my pleasure, sir. Nice to see you. General Hamilton, our former Secretary of State. Ladies, how are you this day? Nice to see you this day. Sir, my pleasure.
She stood for the Secretary of the Treasury.
Oh, I dare say, General, look at this. It is ever the mark of esteem for a lady to offer a gentleman her hand, and I shall take advantage of it. Enchanté. Well, I did not spend 5 delightful years in La Belle France to return without improvement in my manners.
Everything is well with Eliza, yes, and all our children, for the most part. Mr. Jefferson, you know, I'm sorry, but I have to stop for a moment, and I must refer to this latest election. Never have I seen so much maligning, character maligning dialogue, slur trading, vicious, vehement verbiage in the press, and our president called all sorts of things, a callow rake, a libertine, a moral bankrupt, and an orange-headed knave. I'm sorry, Mr. Jefferson, that you've had to bear that sort of thing.
Thank you for reminding me, General. Here upon my own soil. A most delighted visitor you are, though, I dare say. This is the most remarkably unrecorded moment in our nation's history, is it not? That we can all be together here this evening. General, let us share the dais if you are so inclined.
I am so inclined. Shall I be on the left or the right?
Oh, no, sir. If you will, I shall enter to the house right. Left.
Left.
You to the right.
Very good.
And, General, as we ascend here upon the dais, though it concerns me that we may be somewhat heightened and removed from the people, we come together in a common bond.
We do indeed. We do indeed. And thank you so much for the kind repast, the extraordinary dinner, and the amazing selection of wines, many of them French. It makes me almost regret putting a tax on it.
I dare say from the Yelp yonder, one has enjoyed his wine extensively this evening.
Friend of yours?
General, I think it behooves us this evening as we greet our friends and neighbors, considering all of the divisiveness that has been rife throughout our nation of late, the recognition that we continue to differ in opinion upon political economy, and yet no different than has been the difference opinion from time immemorial. We simply have provided it a contemporary expression. But I think in the midst of this, we should pay a great respect to being American, that everyone might realize that as Americans, a difference of opinion ought never be a difference of principle, and to remind everyone what brought 13 former nations together. Each one of those former colonies distant and disparate one from the other in the degree of religious opinion in one versus a vast difference in another, in the degree of freeholders in one versus the greater number of tenants upon the freeholdings in another, that we were able to achieve and show the rest of the world, let alone the monarchy of Great Britain, that we could bring 13 individual nations together, e pluribus unum, through the principle of compromise and resolution for the common good.
Hear, hear. It puts me in mind of those early days in our new government, once we established the Constitution, and you were then our Secretary of State, and I was Secretary of the Treasury, and the agreement we came to. The agreement we came to on the assumption of the war debt. You know, there was a great deal of debt in those days. We were $80 million in debt.
$80 million, citizens. Can you imagine such a vast sum? 80 millions, the very first compromise we endeavored, General. If you will, I think your explanation of your assumption bill is worthy. I shall take a chair.
Please. As I said, we were $80 million in debt. Now, my system for handling the finance was threefold. First, assumption of the debt. Second, take the debt, convert it into interest-bearing bonds, and sell the bonds on the open market. And third, the establishment of a national bank, which we have every right to do.
I beg your pardon?
The bank. I said we...
I was not even at the Constitutional Convention, General, and I know there was no mention, nor even an inference of a national bank in our Constitution.
Well, that may be, but there are implied as well as express powers written into the Constitution. Then it follows that the erection of a corporation, such as a bank, ought to be allowed as anything else. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution states that the Congress may make any law necessary and proper for carrying into effect the listed powers. Therefore, a bank is necessary and ought to be created.
I've heard it all before, General.
Of course you have. But prior to the bank and prior to selling the bonds on the open market, the first thing we needed to do was to establish our national credit, and key to that was the assumption of the debt. Now, when I first met Mr. Madison back in 1783, Mr. Madison and I saw eye to eye. Well, literally, he's just a bit shorter than I am. And Mr. Madison and I knew that we could no longer function under the Articles of Confederation. Mr. Madison and I walked very much hand in hand in those days, so it was with some surprise that I found my up until then friend James Madison had blocked my assumption bill in the House of Representatives, a perfidious desertion of the principles he had sworn to uphold. And I found myself pacing to and fro in front of Federal Hall, and it is then that I ran into Secretary Jefferson.
We were both called before His Excellency, President Washington. I remember when I arrived, you hurled yourself upon me like a tiger of the female gender. We both went in, we both of us appeared before His Excellency to try and ameliorate this controversy, where we should place the nation's capital. Should it be in the center of commerce, in a city such as New York or Philadelphia, or ought it be in the center of our nation, in the farmlands, there where 9 out of every 10 Americans reside? Do you remember His Excellency?
I do remember His Excellency, and I remember appealing to him at the time. I thought there are many places that wanted to be the capital of our great nation. There was Baltimore, Philadelphia, Trenton. And I thought it should be in New York. We had great experience. France, Paris, France is the commerce capital and the capital of the nation. France, London, Great Britain. Experience is the oracle of truth, and where its responses are unequivocal, they should be held sacred and conclusive. And here we had an example set in time. So I thought it appropriate that New York be our capital of our nation as well as our commercial capital.
And yet His Excellency, of course, a farmer, a Virginian. I recall he sat there perplexed. He looked at us and could not make a decision. He could neither decide upon the value of an assumption bill and how it might be taken by the nation any more than he could decide whether our nation's capital should be below the line drawn by Messrs. Mason and Dixon or above it. And so he left the matter unto us to decide. I invited you to my chambers, 57 Maiden Lane there in Lower Manhattan Island. But not the two of us alone. We invited Mr. Madison, the most luminous mind I've ever known. He knows more about ancient history, that which has gone wrong, that which has succeeded, that we may benefit from in this modern world. And there was the three of us to come to a conclusion, to a compromise.
to a compromise. Those days, our fledgling federal government faced serious danger. Talk of secession was rife both in the North and the South. Tensions over a weakened economy had led to much strife amongst the several states. There was great fear of a war between the several states. So we discussed the various ideas, the Assumption Bill and the difficulties in paying out the initial notes, of promissory notes of the federal government, and the difficulties of repaying the soldiers. Then likewise, Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Madison asked me where I thought our capital ought to be, and I said of New York, of course. And you said you wanted it someplace a bit different.
Indeed, in the center of our nation, as far away from the convening of stock jobbers and speculators as we could possibly make it.
I don't understand your vehemence against men who would want to trade. You say it encourages in our people a spirit of vice and idleness. I find it a strange perversion of ideas, and an idea as novel as it is strange, that men should be deemed corrupt and criminal for wanting to become proprietors in the welfare of their nation, either through investing in their stocks on the open market or through purchasing and selling of shares of its national bank.
And this is how it continued, citizens, until the mighty Madison stepped betwixt us and simply suggested that we encourage our own constituencies to accept one and the other's plan, and thereby to maintain this union, that we could continue on. And so it was that I encouraged here in the South the support of General Hamilton's Assumption Bill, as you, sir, were so kind, above the Mason and Dixon, to encourage the North to accept the Residency Act.
We encourage the nation to create its new capital on the banks of the Potomac, with a temporary capital in Philadelphia.
And you remember, as a result, we began to worry about the defense of our coastline. We realized that nature had provided us 3,000 miles of a natural barrier betwixt us and the ancient tumults and calumnies of European kingdoms. And so it was, I felt that we ought to provide an immediate protection of that coastline by militia boats, specifically named militia boats, for the protection of our coast. Now, you had a different idea. You believed in boats as safety and defense, but what did you refer to them as?
We called it a cutter revenue service.
Yes, revenue cutters.
And we created the cutter revenue service under the Revenue Department. Well, you've got the Mint and the State Department. I suppose you've amended that and moved it elsewhere, back to the Treasury where it belongs. But yeah, back in 1777, I wrote describing my ideas of how we were going to be able to prevent people from smuggling goods onto these shores. It was absolutely necessary that we have taxes on, well, all sorts of things coming into this country, you know, French brandy, French linen, French wine. Not that I've got anything against the French. And in order to do so, we need to create a series of cutters to guard our coast, if you will, likewise to ensure against the depredations of piracy.
And yet the point is to guard, protect, and defend, ergo militia boats. And that went on and on and on.
Well, yes, of course it did, but the notion of militia, you know, let's make no mistake, this war of independence was won by a professional army. Say what you will about the militia.
And yet, sir, we effected a compromise.
We did indeed.
Be it called revenue cutters or militia boats, we agreed upon a Coast Guard.
Coast Guard, yes.
Coast Guard, citizens, the two of us together. And yet, of course, I dare say that our economy was still rather unstable, differences of cost and purchase prices betwixt all our new states and commonwealths. It required a standardization of the political economy, and we argued over that as well, did we not?
We did indeed, and as I said, it was established in those days, I think, to ameliorate yourself, because your loss on the bank, that we had a bank, that General Washington gave you the Mint in the State Department, which makes no sense whatsoever.
He also gave me the Patent Department, which allowed me to preside over the commission of the ingenuity of the American mind, which I did delightfully until, of course, I resigned that position and the Patent Department went unto you. It did. It went under the Treasury.
I offered you the post office. Be that as it may, we came to an agreement on a system of finance, and you looked to the ancient Greeks for your decimal system.
You allowed me the
currency.
opportunity, indeed, to divide our specie, our coin, in tenths of 100, the ancient decimal system, to make it the easier for the common man to understand, and that then to be universal throughout our nation. Another compromise, sir.
Another well-effected compromise.
Indeed it was.
Yes.
And I will say, citizens, not without the continuing argument over the necessity of a standing army. Now consider, citizens, what a drain this would be upon our treasury.
It's
to maintain a standing army in times of peace. Explain yourself, General. I shall have a chair.
It's absolutely imperative that we have a standing army to defend us in time of need. And as I said before, say what you will about the militia, make no mistake, this war of independence was won by professional soldiery. It wasn't until after our tribulations and our crucible at Valley Forge, where we were formed into a single, solitary, not militias, but single, solitary, cohesive army, that we began to win that war. And it is absolutely necessary to call to the distant reaches to get a militia together to effect an effective defense is absolutely inefficacious.
But, sir, if there is a necessity, if there is an immediate need for the people to call for an army, to call for a militia, they will rouse themselves to it. Otherwise, if we allow for a standing army in times of peace, may not further other nations, foreign nations, wonder what we are up to?
Let them wonder. We need to be able to guard our coast, to guard ourselves. We still have Florida owned by the Spanish, a cannon that is aimed at this nation. If I had my way during our war with France, I would have invaded Florida.
No, I think we should leave Florida alone. I would be worried if she would ever desire to enter our union and be of great complication in the future. But, sir, if you will, we recognized finally that if there must be a standing army, that you agreed it must be led by an enlightened officer corps.
Of course it must.
Indeed, an institution that might place an emphasis upon the building of fortifications, our national defense first and foremost, that a school of engineering, the first in our nation, might be employed to enlighten such officers, and thereby, sir, as you know, just recently, but a few years past, we have effected another compromise when you allowed me to commission our military academy at West Point.
Right. I had the notion back in '77, but a capital one it was, and I was glad to support it. Likewise, we have come to agree, well, you know, we've disagreed on so many things. We've disagreed on the bank, on the assumption bill, though we came to an agreement on that. We disagree on where the power ought to be placed in our nation. We've disagreed on finance and trading of stocks on the open market. But we have come to an agreement, most particularly of late. It was the agreement in the election of 1800. When you stood tied in the Electoral College.
One gentleman here, I beg your pardon, General, is continuing to find great levity in that election of 1800. You still are enjoying a good guffaw of it, are you not, sir? I haven't laughed over it for many years now, I'm happy to tell you. Our nation almost divided. 73 electoral votes each for Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson. And for many, many days, the United States of America did not know who would become the next president. I declare, General, can you ever imagine such a thing happening in our history again?
I cannot. I hope it'll never happen again. And in those days, well, initially we withheld support between the two of you. Of course, there were many Federalists who wanted Burr for the presidency, which I was vehemently against. They wanted Burr because he was a New Yorker. And many Federalists were New Yorkers. Likewise, they thought he was more governable. They were more worried about what you would do upon becoming president of these United States. And I was less worried so. I think I said at the time, I think you would be less likely to throw away the reins of power once you had them. But in the case, we came to an agreement through intermediaries. We asked for certain things, and you were able to give them to us.
It was in the letter that you sent me, sir. The letter that I received from one at the opposite end of the political spectrum from me. I will never forget that day when I opened your missive. I will never forget the first line, and the very first line you wrote. Mr. Jefferson, I consider you the least dangerous of the two candidates. That's what he said. It's exactly what he said.
I am certain these people will never have been in a position where they voted for the lesser evil. I'm not certain what that was about, but be that as it may, when it comes to Burr, you know, I've had a long association with Colonel Burr. I knew Colonel Burr during the war. At one point, we were cut off from the rest of the army, and I was very happy to see Colonel Burr that day because he led us back along a secret route so we may rejoin Washington and his army. Burr was an aide-de-camp to General Washington. I was an aide-de-camp to General Washington. Burr was with the general a month, I think. They didn't get on. I was with the general for 4 years. Mr. Burr and I are attorneys in New York. We've argued on the same sides of cases. We've argued on opposite sides of cases. I haven't seen much substance to his arguments. And in the election of 1800, in the tie, though Jefferson be a man of very different principles, at least he has them. Something I suspect not to be the case with Colonel Burr. I will give you an example. When we were at war with France, General Washington was commander-in-chief of the army, and I was his second in command at that time, major general in the army. And we lost General Washington, which was a very sad day, and I think there is no American who has more cause to lament the general's passing than I do. But I found myself in command of the army. And in those days, Adams was president, and, I was having trouble with President Adams, but, you know, that was not a singular instance. I'm sure you know.
He can be vain and irritable, but that is the only ill I can say about him. Otherwise, knowing him far longer than yourself, you cannot be in his presence but a few moments and feel a great affection for him. I still bear that, General. I still do. We are distant in our politics at present.
He was called in the Jeffersonian press a hoary-headed incendiary. This is unprosecutable under the Sedition Act, as that is an entirely truthful statement.
Back to Burr.
Back to
General.
Burr, yes. We can certainly agree on Burr and Adams. When I was general of the army, I wrote to Burr describing my difficulties, and Burr wrote back to me, "The Constitution is but a paper machine. You have it within your means to make yourself happy. In other words, you have the army, go in and take over the government." And I wrote back, that sort of thing is absolutely reprehensible. And Burr wrote back, "Great men do not trifle over morsels." And that's the sort of man who could have been president of these United States.
He has neglected to show any interest in being reelected as vice president. In fact, he has turned down the invitation. And so now the Democratic-Republican platform is faced with the idea of another candidate. We seem to be looking to a gentleman who resides in New York by the name of Clinton.
Oh,
Clinton.
Governor Clinton.
I do not find him laughable, citizens. He is the longest-serving governor of any state in our union. I'm referring to George Clinton. George Clinton, Vice President Burr, is now looking to retire, or so I would hope.
I'm quite surprised you gave him the opportunity.
Well, the point of the matter is I am still very cautious of him, and thereby I should fess up to what I have already written and inform you and all others that I consider him a crooked barrel whose shot you can never depend upon. Now, bear that in mind.
You know, usually when I talk about Burr, I am cautioned in the same breath against dueling, and I'm not certain as to why. I know it'd be an extraordinary thing for you in your days to imagine that a vice president of the United States should shoot someone, but in my day. They are full of ribaldry this evening.
I think there's been a profusion of French wine long before we ever came out here.
That's quite well enough as long as we're getting a tax on it.